Welcome to Heart of Texas Histories and Mysteries. I'm your host, Em, coming to you as always from deep in the heart of Texas. Today, we'll be discussing a series of crimes that rocked Northeast Texas and Southwest Arkansas in 1946. Crimes remain unsolved to this day, although over the years, one name has been brought up more than any other when it comes to possible suspects. Let's set the scene. World War II had ended only a few months earlier. The twin cities of Texarkana, Texas, and Texarkana, Arkansas, like the rest of America, were celebrating the victory of the United States and its allies. Although they would never forget the loved ones and friends they had lost during the war, residents of these neighboring communities were thrilled to see service members come home and life return to normal. In small cities like the twin Texarkanas, this was a time in history when people felt safe leaving their doors unlocked and letting their children play outside unsupervised. But that sense of security was about to come to an end. At approximately 11:45 p.m. on Friday, February 22nd, 1946, 25-year-old Jimmy Hollis and his girlfriend, 19-year-old Mary Jeanne Larey, were parked on a relatively isolated road in Texarkana, Texas. This road was known as a lover's lane, and Jimmy and Mary Jeanne had gone there after a date to the movies. Suddenly, a man holding a flashlight appeared next to the driver's side of Jimmy's car. He was wearing a white mask with eye holes that looked like it had been made out of a pillowcase. Jimmy told him he had the wrong person, but the man said, "I don't want to kill you, fellow, so do what I say." The man ordered both Jimmy and Mary Jeanne to get out of the vehicle through the driver's side door. He demanded that Jimmy take his pants off, then hit Jimmy so hard in the head with a pistol that Mary Jeanne at first thought the loud sound she heard was that of the weapon being fired. Thinking that the man intended to rob them, she tried to appeal to him by showing him Jimmy's empty wallet. But the attacker didn't care about that. Instead, he hit Mary Jeanne with a blunt object before ordering her to run. She headed for a ditch, but he yelled at her to go up the road. Mary Jeanne spotted a parked car and rushed to it, hoping there was someone inside who could help. But it was empty. Meanwhile, the assailant had caught up with her. He asked her why she had run away from him, and when she reminded him that he had told her to do so, he called her a liar and assaulted her with a barrel of his pistol. Somehow, Mary Jeanne managed to escape from him and ran to a house about half a mile away. Fortunately, the residents were home and called the police. Jimmy regained consciousness after the attack and signaled to a passing motorist, who pulled over to assist him. Both victims were taken to the hospital. Mary Jeanne was released quite quickly. Jimmy, who had sustained several skull fractures, was hospitalized for a few days. By the time law enforcement arrived at the location of the attack, the assailant was long gone. Unfortunately, Mary Jeanne and Jimmy were unable to provide a solid description of the man. The only detail that they both seemed certain about was that he was at least 6 feet tall. They made differing statements as to what race they thought their attacker was, leading some members of law enforcement to doubt their story. Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jeanne Larey were lucky to be alive. But a violent criminal was still on the loose, and sadly, his deeds were about to turn deadly. When a motorist noticed a car parked on another lover's lane near U.S. Highway 67 West on the morning of Sunday, March 24, 1946, he initially thought the man and woman inside of it were sleeping. But as it turned out, 29-year-old Richard Griffin and his girlfriend, 17-year-old Polly Ann Moore, were deceased in the vehicle. They had both been shot in the back of the head, and Richard had been shot twice. Richard was on his knees between the front seats, and his pants pockets had been turned inside out. Polly Ann was lying face down on the back seat. Bloody dirt near the vehicle led investigators to speculate that the two victims had been killed outside and then moved into the car. Some accounts state that a bloody blanket was found near the car and that the assailant may have killed Polly Ann on this blanket before relocating her body to the car. Law enforcement found a .32 caliber casing at the scene. Although the killings of Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore sent shockwaves throughout Texarkana, Texas, it seems that law enforcement and the public viewed these violent deaths as unrelated to the attack on Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jeanne Larey. But when another couple was found deceased, area residents had to come to grips with the truth. They had a dangerous serial perpetrator in their midst. On Sunday, April 14, 1946, at approximately 1:30 a.m., 17-year-old Paul Martin picked up 15-year-old Betty Jo Booker at the VFW Club, where she had participated in a musical performance. Betty Jo's mother had been expecting Betty Jo to make a quick stop at the house and drop off her saxophone before spending some time with Paul, but she never came home. Betty Jo's mother then called several of Betty Jo and Paul's friends, but none of them had seen or heard from them. So she turned to the police, who set off to search for the two teens. Sadly, they located Paul Martin's body on a rural road at around 6:30 that same morning. He had been shot through the right hand, through the nose, through the back of the neck, and through the ribs from behind. Betty Jo Booker's body was discovered several hours later, about 2 miles away from Paul's. She had been shot once in the face and once in the chest. Investigators determined that Paul and Betty Jo had been shot with a .32 caliber pistol, just as Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore had been. Paul's car was found just outside of Spring Lake Park with the keys still inside. This was approximately 3 miles from where Betty Jo was found. Bowie County Sheriff Bill Presley and Captain Manuel Gonzalez of the Texas Rangers said that it was clear from the examinations of Paul and Betty Jo's bodies that they had both fought for their lives. The murders of Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker hit the community especially hard. It was impossible to understand how anyone could have wanted to harm these two church-going teenagers. The city set curfews for businesses to discourage people from being out and about at night. It was around this time that the local media began referring to the unknown perpetrator as the Phantom Killer. Unfortunately, the string of crimes was not yet over, and this time it would cross state lines. On the evening of Friday, May 3, 1946, 37-year-old Virgil Starks and his wife, 36-year-old Katie, were at home on their farm outside of Texarkana, Arkansas. Virgil was reading a newspaper when out of nowhere, someone shot him twice in the back of the head through a closed window. Katie, who had been in another room, ran in to see her husband briefly stand before collapsing back into his chair. He was already deceased. She hurried to the phone, but before she could connect with the police department, she herself was shot twice in the face through the same window. Katie went to look for a pistol, but she was bleeding so heavily from her face that she couldn't see. Hearing the shooter at the back of the house, she managed to escape through the front door and run to the nearby home of her sister and brother-in-law, but they weren't home. Fortunately, another neighboring family was home and drove Katie to the hospital. Katie Starks survived her injuries. She eventually remarried and she lived until 1994. But Virgil's murder was never solved. Early on, there was a rumor that a car had stopped in front of the Starks' home several nights in a row, not long before the crime, and that Virgil had been afraid someone was after him. But Katie told the police that this wasn't true, leaving law enforcement with little to work with besides a flashlight that had been left at the scene. It seems that everyone in the Texarkana area was convinced that the Phantom Killer was behind the murder of Virgil Starks and the attempted murder of Katie Starks. Somewhere around this time, Texas law enforcement stated publicly that there was a connection between the attack on Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jeanne Larey and the 3 deadly attacks that occurred afterward. People in the area were now living on edge. They were taking more care to lock their doors, using screen door braces to better secure their windows, and purchasing new window coverings. Some parents elected to have their children sleep in their rooms with them. The demand for guard dogs was on the rise, and people were stocking up on firearms and ammunition. Concerns about the Phantom Killer spread beyond Texas and Arkansas. In Oklahoma City, for example, there was a huge increase in the sale of guns and axes. The fear and panic subsided as the summer of 1946 closed without another attack from the Phantom Killer. but there were still no answers as to who this person was. It's been said that law enforcement questioned and cleared approximately 400 men in the quest to solve the mystery. At one point, some undercover officers even attempted to trick the perpetrator by parking on lovers' lanes with mannequins dressed as teenagers in their patrol cars, but the suspect never took the bait. Out of all the men who were considered as suspects, 18-year-old Henry Booker Tennyson, also known as Duty, was one law enforcement looked at more carefully. H.B. Tennyson was a freshman at the University of Arkansas when he took his own life in 1948. He confessed to the murders of Paul Martin, Betty Jo Booker, and Virgil Starks in his suicide note. He had gone to the same high school as Betty Jo and had been in the band with her, but the two were not known to have been friends and also don't appear to have been related. Some sources say that law enforcement ultimately decided Mr. Tennyson's confession was one of many false confessions they encountered during the course of the investigation. In any event, he did not turn out to be the top suspect in the series of attacks. Detective Max Tackett of the Arkansas State Police, who had responded to the scene in the Starks case, noticed a pattern. On the night of each attack, a car had been reported stolen and another car that had previously been reported stolen had been found abandoned. When a local farmer called the police to report a tenant who hadn't paid rent, it seemed that the pieces might be falling into place. The farmer provided the tenant's name, Youell Swinney, as well as his license plate number. As it turned out, the car 29-year-old Youell Swinney was driving had been reported stolen on the night Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore were killed. Swinney's wife, Peggy, told authorities that he was the Phantom Killer and described the murders of Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker in some detail. Some sources say that certain things Peggy mentioned, such as where items belonging to the victims had been thrown away, did turn out to be true. But the more investigators spoke with her, the more Peggy's story changed. She also refused to testify against her husband, which was her legal right. Youell Swinney was never prosecuted for any of the murders, but he did receive a life sentence for being a habitual car thief. Some investigators later stated that this had really been a plea bargain, and that Swinney had accepted it out of the belief that he would have been found guilty of the murders and sentenced to death. Ultimately, Youell Swinney did not spend the remainder of his life in prison. He was released in 1978 and died at a nursing home in Dallas in 1994. Many people, including Detective Tackett, spent the remainder of their lives believing that he had gotten away with a string of murders. Officially, however, the identity of the Phantom Killer was never confirmed, and the victims and their families never found justice. So there you have it, the story of the Texarkana Phantom Killer. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, y'all.